In the beginning for us is going to be about 12,000 years ago. Some people say 14,000, some people say 10,000. We are going to Ptolemaicaally split the baby in half and say 12,000 years ago. Prior to 12,000 years ago, everybody on the planet was a hunter and or a gatherer. That means that they hunted animals and they foraged for edible plants like berries and nuts and fruits and roots. In other words, wild growing plants. The people who did that in this pre-agricultural time, 12,000 years ago and backwards beyond that, almost certainly lived in very small groups, certainly no more than 50 people, because bigger groups would exhaust the resources. And those people tended to be very mobile. This is before cities began to evolve on this planet. And then, beginning about 12,000 years ago, people began to figure out how to domesticate plants and animals. In other words, take control of them and grow these things for their own purposes, which of course stabilized food supply and cut down on mobility as well, of course, because they didn't need to be mobile. They stayed in the same area and produced the plants and animals that they then consumed and utilized. There's two types of plants plus the animals. I want you to understand this before I go through it. There are going to be several hearths, places where domestication of particular plants and animals began. It's not as if what happened is the domestication of plants and animals began at one place and then spread throughout the world from that one place. There was some of that that happened. And of course, when plants and animals were domesticated in a particular area, the people that were in the closest proximity then benefited from that because then they began to domesticate the same plants and animals. And then over time, through trade, things moved around. But in a way, simultaneously on this planet, people began to figure out how to domesticate plants and animals. In other words, how to take control of plants and animals, grow them and produce them, and actually begin to hybrid them very early for the purposes of human beings using these things. Let's go through them. First, for our purposes, there's what's known as vegetative planting. Vegetative planting means this. This is the reproducing of plants through the use of cuttings, transplantings, and dividing roots. In other words, you just take a chunk of the plant and put it in the ground and it grows. You're not using seeds to do this. There were multiple places on the planet that this began to happen several thousand years ago, maybe going back as far as 10,000 years or so. Southeast Asia, which you see on the map. Taro, which is what you see there, it's a root in that photograph. Banana, of course we all know what that is, and palm. All of those began to be domesticated in Southeast Asia. In Western Africa, which you see on that map. Oil palm and yams. Now I think you know what a yam is. There's a difference between a sweet potato and a yam. Yams are generally the orange one. Sweet potatoes are the lighter colored one. Oil palm, like palm oil, which is what you see in that picture, in those fruit that you see growing there, coming out of the plant, that's the stuff that you turn into the oil, which of course allows you to cook with it. Andean South America, in other words, where the Andes are in South America, running all up along the west coast of South America. Potatoes and manioc, which is also known as cassava, which is a root that you see there. You just cut part of the root off. Where there's an eye that grows, you stick that into the ground and it grows, and it makes all sorts of other roots, and at the end of those, you get these tubers. Potatoes and manioc are both grown the same way. You cut pieces off and stick them into the ground. And maybe sweet potatoes, although Mesoamerica, which is that area from Mexico down through Central America, Mesoamerica may also be the hearth of sweet potatoes. This is kind of undetermined. But you can see sweet potatoes in that photograph there. You cut off a piece, you stick it in the ground, and then it grows roots, and off those roots you get each one of these sweet potatoes. Seed agriculture is this. It involves the direct introduction of seeds into the ground. Now, obviously, this is a kind of more complex intellectual process. And it probably started with grasses that produced edible grains on their heads, like you see in 3 of those pictures, with the rice, the wheat, and the corn. And then coffee is something different. So let's look at the seed agricultural hearths. First of all, Mesopotamia, which is that area between the Tigris and Euphrates River in what is modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers. Most people believe this is the first place on earth where settled agriculture began. And then, of course, from there, you can see it spread along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and into the Nile. And some stuff came out of the Nile and went the other direction as well. And it created that big croissant-shaped area called the Fertile Crescent. So probably 12,000 years ago, people began to produce wheat and barley from the natural growing grasses that were there. In all likelihood, it was the women who came up with this. And the reason is because of this. In most hunter-gatherer societies, the men were the hunters, the women were the gatherers. And what probably happened was the women had a really good couple of days of gathering grains. They were sitting by the fire. Someone accidentally knocked over a basket. They picked up as many of the grains as they could, put them back in. The next day it rained. They were still there 3 days later, and they noticed the grains began to sprout. And bang! The idea popped in their head, what would happen if we did this? Also, the Indus River Valley. Now, the word Indus in Sanskrit means river. So the Indus River means river, literally. And of course, the country India is named after the Ganges River, which is a river. That's where we get the word India from the word Indus, which means river. And the Indus River Valley, which runs through Pakistan, is also an area where wheat and barley, along with old world cotton, began to be produced and domesticated maybe 8,000 years ago. Southeast Asia, well, this is an important place, including southern China. Rice, it was a naturally growing grass there. People figured out how to reproduce it. And one of the most important grains in the world that produces vast amounts of calories for lots and lots of people on the planet began to be domesticated. Northeast China, millet, which is what you see in that picture. Now, in the United States, we don't eat a lot of millet, but it is increasingly becoming one of these ancient grains that people are turning to eat to diversify their diet. So we're beginning to eat it more. In Ethiopia, coffee, millet, and sorghum. Sorghum is what you see in that picture right there. All of these grainy things, with the exception of the coffee, which is seeds. And again, sorghum is becoming one of these ancient grains that people are beginning to eat more of in the United States. Probably the biggest one for seed agriculture was Mesoamerica. So again, Mexico down through Central America. Corn, also known as maize. Tomatoes, squash, cacao, which you make chocolate out of. Beans, chilies, avocado, all coming from that area. And in Andean South America, beans, some types of beans like the Peru bean, squash, and American cotton. What about domesticated animals? Take a look at those. Pig, sheep, dog, chickens. By the way, that rooster you see there, his name was Casanova. Look at him. He was my rooster. Handsome guy. Look at him. Cows, llama. Take a look at those animals. Which of those would you eat and which ones would you not eat? And think about why that is. Pigs and dogs are of about the same intelligence. What is it that causes people to eat one thing and not another thing when it comes to animals or food in general? That's called culture. So in Southeast Asia, chickens, pigs, and dogs were all domesticated. Now, dogs were domesticated in a lot of different areas, as were cats. Andean South America, llama, alpaca, and cuy. What is cuy? Guinea pig. Mesoamerica, turkey may very well have come from there. Now, turkeys were all over the place in the New World, but this may be the place that it was domesticated. In Mesopotamia, draft animals like cattle, water buffalo, and sheep and goats.